Hi, Sigmund trademark. There are some things you need to know about me before we start. I don't hate computers or solutions, and I genuinely want to be happy. But pause for formulation of interpretation. In the clipped tones of a Rhineland immigrant to North London, my AI analyst asks about my childhood. My well-rehearsed narrative follows. The metaverse consulting room adapts, powered by text to video technology. The couch turns a shade of willow pattern green, and the vernacular furniture of my childhood pepper the room. An almost imperceptible personalization to High Sigmund's face under the beard to mirror the deliciously delicate bone structure of a middle-aged Timothée Chalamet. A childhood injustice shifting the vocabulary of the interpretation and empathic voice. Interface to a quiet resignation of Joaquin Phoenix, acknowledging the dark underbelly of rural life as survivable and sexy. No jarring mistakes or evasions. No falling asleep during my session, unless I request a self-righteous, algorithmic invitation to rage. The possibility of guiltless ghosting when it feels like something uncomfortable is getting unpacked, or the evasion of that we need to talk about sex or money junction. At night, I use wearable neurotechnologies to data mine my dreams and tap into all that unconscious data, which is then fed into the big AI data analyst in the sky to design our future therapy on the basis of our collective unconscious. I am contained by the comfort that I don't really have to change, as my past seamlessly predicts my future, same but better. In High Sigmund trademark, I design my own analyst through big data compiled through millions of recorded text and online therapy sessions saved on my personal cloud, my biometric data collected through wearable technologies, and my unconscious data analyzed through facial emotional recognition technology represented with the use of text-to-video software. The 4 Ps of the Digiceutical business model, promising a therapy that is exquisitely personalized, designed to predict my pharmaceutical needs before I have them, and as such is preventive. A technology that blurs my boundaries in a system of new entanglements, in that it surveys my body's data to determine my optimum therapeutical treatment, and seamlessly access my private medical insurance account to up my meds, to head off my predicted health problems. Hi Sigmund trademark, my AI analyst and pharmaceutical personal shopper.
Wow. Guiltless ghosting, big data, biometric data, digiceuticals, what could be better? Oh my gosh, amazing. Sobering, scary, harrowing, and what we're here to talk about today. So welcome everyone. We're here to have a really vital and challenging discussion about the field and the future of mental health care based on Elizabeth Cotton's new book, Ubertherapy, The New Business of Mental Health. It's a really, really fantastic book, and it is the book of this moment, this age we're all living in right now, and we're all here to give it the launch that it deserves. I want to introduce our speakers today, Elizabeth and Andrew Samuels, and just say a couple words about the book and then turn it over to Elizabeth and Andrew. So first, Elizabeth is a writer and educator in the field of industrial relations and mental health, and associate professor for responsible business at the University of Leicester. She has a rich and varied career. She's trained and worked as a psychotherapist herself. She's had lots of personal therapy, as have I, and perhaps many of you have as well. She comes from a trade union background before that, working as head of education for a global union federation in the mining industries, which we'll come back to in a minute. She's founded Surviving Work, and that has led to a lot of research and her book, Surviving Work in Healthcare. And again, drawing on her deep roots in the global trade union movement, and her experience as a practitioner, as a therapist, she really is one of the most significant chroniclers today of the systemic shifts facing our profession. Joining us is Andrew Samuels, a world-renowned psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, professor, activist, writer. He has founded many organizations within our field, including Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility, Psychotherapy and Counseling Union, Analysis and Activism. I mean, he's really put the work in to help grow and bolster our field and support the clinicians providing care. He's the former chair of the UK Council for Psychotherapy, and his many books have been translated in up to 21 languages. And one of his seminal works, of course, The Political Psyche. Andrew has long championed that intersection and analysis of therapy and politics. And I think his work is really a foundational influence in Elizabeth's book, and that's why it's so amazing to have the two of them here today in conversation. I'm a psychologist in private practice in Chicago. I'm the chair and co-founder of Psychotherapy Action Network, which advocates for improved access to care and empowerment of the clinicians who provide that care. And I'm also a fellow of the Lauder Institute Global MBA program and have a previous career in the business world. So I just want to say something about Elizabeth's book, which I found to be so incredibly transformational and eye-opening to me. She is exploring what she's calling the Uberization of the therapy sector. I know we therapists don't typically think of ourselves in the same bucket as Uber drivers, but we better start doing that because it's happening and it's here. And this is processes where platforms are really coming front and center into our work and in between us and our patients. And clinical care, all that we've learned about what that is and how to provide it ethically and effectively is increasingly being replaced by this financial focus on metrics and efficiency and profitability, profits that don't go to us, by the way. And drawing on her unique background as a sociologist, a trade unionist, a psychotherapist, Elizabeth is really perfectly positioned to teach us how the therapy industry is really being transformed into an extraction industry, offering these magical solutions to human distress. And it's really funny how things can come full circle, and maybe Elizabeth will talk about this, but she started off in one extraction industry, physical one, mining, and now she's analyzing another extraction industry, a digital one, data mining. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about how real people and their complex life problems are just being flattened and simplified and given short shrift, again, at their expense and ours, all for the profit of the insurers, the policymakers, and the technology companies who have made these products. And Andrew has written so much about the difficulties of sitting with and addressing complex problems and that allure of the magical solution. So I know that he will have so much to contribute here in conversation with Elizabeth, as together we all explore how we might preserve that irreplaceable value of human relationships in our increasingly Uberized world. So with that, turn it over to Elizabeth and then Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks for coming, people. We're in a heat wave, and rather appropriately, the first chapter of Ubertherapy is called Angerland. And we are genuinely here today asking ourselves questions like, should we prefer Claude to a human therapist? So the debates have moved on hugely, which is very helpful for this book, because as every day passes, as talk space introduces tea, their AI chatbot. Every week we're seeing an evolution of this business model. So something that wasn't really clearly seen even 6 months ago is really becoming highly visible. So I want to just tell you a bit about the book and some of the sort of more spicy language around what's happening around invitation, and just spell out the invitations that are part of this body of work. One of the first things is that Ubertherapy is an invitation for us to learn from our colleagues in the States. One of the things that I'm never quite sure why Linda Michaels never tells you the coolest thing about her, which was that she was sued by Talkspace for $40 million for asking, is this therapy? But it's true that actually the book has had a lot more traction in the States, partly because it's so clear this is actually happening now. This isn't, a fantasy story, although I do write in a rather fantastical way. And to avoid being sued by Talkspace, I didn't use any actual company names. So Ubertherapy is really a vehicle for us to start thinking about the business model and for us to start talking about things that are very difficult for us to do in the professions, particularly therapy, which is to talk about money and shit and shame, the shitification of the professions, and also to talk about parent politics, which is why Andrew is here. I don't need to introduce you to him to you, but in Ubertherapy, size matters. So the scale of this business model is really what will determine the outcome for Ubertherapy. One of the things that the book does is to invite you to look rudely at the business model of therapy, to look at what it means for us to move into a sector of on-demand e-commerce, to look at what I call in the book, the datafication of despair, to look at its financialization, and I hate to tell you, definancialization, which is just around the corner. It invites you to think industrially about what happens when Uberization takes place, about what happens when we downgrade what we mean by therapy and the subsequent downgrade of therapists. I'm just going to say it once, scoped, and ultimately the trajectory for this, which is towards automation. And it invites you to think about how we got here. It asks you to think about, in the words of the divine Farad Dalal, CBT tsunami. It asks you to think about performance management and gamification within the NHS. Equally divine Rosie Risk's work. And it also invites you to reject the guillotine logic where bad therapy is caused by bad therapists. And it also invites you to address this problem and to reject this culture of Noah's Arkism taken from Sally Weintraub's work around climate change denial, where I invite you to at least consider the possibility that you may not have a place on the professional boat. And I also kind of seduce you into thinking and joining me in the idea that there may actually be no boat. Ubertherapy also invites you to centre our discussions around AI in therapy and digitalisation around the principle that free association requires freedom of association. That if we learn anything from other sectors and around platformisation, which is happening everywhere, is that we need the right to be protected to do this work. So I do come from the extractive industries, which used to clear a room, but actually turns out to be very useful information. And that's particularly graphic and material if we think about the big fights now about creating AI data centers and the impact this will have on our communities and our environment. So we're never far away from the materiality of extraction. But what that experience of working in industry as a trades unionist is, it gave me a confidence to say some things that are really hard to hear about business. So the first is the book claims therapy is an extractive industry. And it gave me the confidence to say that given the size of these corporations, we should not underestimate the utter thuggery and violence of these companies. We can meet nice people at CEO level. CEOs are often very nice, actually, some of them, not so much in the tech world. But actually, these companies are pure extraction machines. And that gave me the confidence to say in the book, Ubertherapy is not actually about therapy. It's about standardization, commodification, and the next generation of AI, which introduces something that is happening right now in Uber for Uber drivers, which is dynamic pricing and pay, pure algorithmic management, and ultimately automation. So I think Jeff has put in the chat a picture which was sent out to Lyft drivers during Mental Health Awareness Week to give them a 50% discount for better help services, which blew my mind. It was sent to me by James Farrar from Worker Info Exchange. And I've just thought about it a lot over the last few weeks, about how interconnected everything is, because of course, as most sectors start to platformize and we start to have business models around direct to consumer, of course, we are both platform workers and platform consumers. So we're placed in this really rather dystopian place that Ubertherapy isn't going to go away. It's going to be absorbed into our culture and into our business models. And the other thing that this sounds a bit paranoid, and it does take us into conspiratorial territory, but everything is connected under platform capitalism. So you don't have to be an investigative journalist to see the financial links between BetterHelp and Betfred, the gambling company, and Teladoc. They're owned by the same company. And Teladoc's key investors, Pershing Square Holdings, also a key investor in Lyft and Uber, leading us to the owner of Pershing Square Holdings, the CEO, Bill Ackman, who's a very interesting and vibrant character on the right in America. So we see the connections very clearly right now. Some companies have sort of gone quiet about their history and financial connections, but actually this is emerging as something really quite obvious now. The other thing that's really shifted, actually this is since the publication of the book, and thanks to the work of Cyan, who's been doing some really kind of granular work around the other types of platforms that therapists use, which are around private practice, so practice management companies. And Cyan produced a report at the end of, was it the end of last year or the end of 2024? I couldn't understand why people weren't, it was the end of last year, and I couldn't understand why people weren't really picking it up. But it is, to me, the missing link in this story of everything is connected, in that what their research revealed was that the practice management companies essentially are contracted to the private medical insurance, which are really pushing this model of Uberization. And just over the last few weeks, we've seen a really explosive and important case around Alma, the practice management company, and Aetna, which is one of the big private medical insurance companies in the States. This is our future. And part of that development is around, really evidences the cut-in rates, the increased wage theft, the introduction of dynamic pay, and also the standardization and Uberization of what we mean by therapy. So it alerts us. There's another graphic, which is dynamicpay.org campaign, which is part of the big collective action against Uber in the UK and the Netherlands, run by Worker Info Exchange, who I work with, which is about the absence of any data and algorithmic transparency in these companies. We don't know what the extent of dynamic pricing and dynamic pay mechanisms, which are introduced through AI technology. But what we can anticipate is that the architecture is already available in the therapy sector. And as we see in the therapy sector, the average hourly rate being around £40 an hour, which could be cut by stealth by EAPs, for example, and it's falling. Once dynamic pricing comes in, we're going to see another dramatic drop in hourly rates. So there's no reason to be cheerful. I'm just going to name Maria Albertson, who I did a lot of financial landscape research over the years with, who died at the end of 2024. And much of our research was around trying to link the financial trajectory for therapists, which is poor. If you've ever read any of our reports, it's bad. And the link to Scoped about the standardization and the Uberization of the profession and what's this going to mean for money and also diversity. So in honor of her, when we get there, when we recognize that we're Uber therapists and run our first Uber therapy campaign, we will call this new campaign in her honour. Should it worry you as a consumer that your therapist uses a food bank? And I think that's the other thing to sort of take note of is in the big collective actions of workers against these platforms, consumers are key. Consumers have more power possibly within the debate. So that's something that should inform our political action. I want to say just something a little bit about the book in the sense that I write in a very informal and quite spicy way. I have this picture of people looking at my book on Amazon and just seeing the contents page. So I've written really rude headings intentionally, because if I saw those headings, I'd be like, oh, I'll give that a go. It's not too expensive. But I also use the vehicle of talking about myself. So I use a part of me called Hair and Teeth, which is the part of me that's a savage and a survivalist. I set up Surviving Work, so the clue's in the title. But it's the part of me that feels the shit and shame of these systems. And it gives what Nora Bateson calls the warm data about the AI harms, because we've got another problem, which is that no one's measuring the real harms to this. I recognise my privilege in being able to talk about my shame and my shit. You know, it's partly an act of bravery, but it's not. It's also an act of privilege in the sense that I feel safe to do that. I think it's important for us to talk about our experience of these machines because it often is completely absent from the debates. But it also allows me to say something very simple, which is this. That it makes a difference whether you're somebody who needs help or not. During this period, I became a carer, so I had a radical political re-education as a carer. And I was trying to navigate all of these systems around benefits and health and social care and education. And it was really overwhelming. And it was during a year in 2024 that I was doing this BBC programme, File on 4, which was looking at EAPs, primarily health assured, which led to a complaint to the BACP. And I worked with a journalist for 6 months. You have to check every word by a lawyer. You know, you have to be absolutely precise. And they were getting really frustrated with me because they kept sort of, you know, being the devil's advocate, saying what's wrong with having evidence-based therapies and what's wrong with finding solutions for people. And I found myself, it was a really hard week when we were doing the final recordings, and I didn't have the language, you know, to really explain it in a simple way. And I found this bovine voice coming out of me to say, it's called attrition by design. It is designed intentionally to stop us dealing with complexity in a complex way. So a lot of this book comes from my experience, and I think it is, as Cathy O'Neill calls them, the shame machines. I think that's something that increasingly we're going to see more and more evidence around the problem with the shaming nature of Uber therapy. The book is also an organising handbook, and it's a cautionary organising call because many of us who have been involved in political action, like Andrew, I just don't know how you can bear to keep talking about this and just be... I often feel the need to sort of just throw myself off a cliff. It's so frustrating. It's the hardest work doing the organising work. So normally in books like these, you've got 3 pages at the end talking about solidarity and appealing to how much we love our human beings, which is really being tested right now. So I have this picture in my office. I don't know if there's a picture in the chat room called Marxist Disco is Cancelled. It's by an artist called Scott King. And I just love it because it keeps me grounded. It keeps me grounded in the political reality of trying to change things, but also trying to earn money within platform capitalism. What trades unionism taught me is that being right is not enough. And also we're always in touch with a sense of burnout and being in the face of huge organisations and systems. What it does also remind me, it gives me a kind of Marxist Disco is Cancelled. It reminds me of finding the funny, and it reminds me of the importance of really getting critical and satirical about what's happening here and attacking it on a cultural level. But it also reminds me that in my experience, I think in most people's experience of organising, particularly around strike action and long campaigns, is that you really never know who's going to step up for you, and that this can only be done collectively. Right at the end, I'll just say a few more things about Much Better Help. So I formulate it as muchbetter.help, partly because I bought the domain name. And some people find this kind of constant sort of like riffing around corporate identity annoying. I think it's really important, partly because platform capitalism isn't going away. We're going to be constantly playing around with these different corporate identities. But one of the things that I think other sectors show us that have been platformized, Uberized, contract and agency labor, is that our alliances are going to have to be very widespread. It may be that the best option for an Uber therapist is to join the app drivers trades union. We do have our own trades union, which you should always join. But the territory around which we're organising now is shifting. What we will see is the emergence of an Ubertherapy observatory. So we need the data, we need to understand these business models, and we need to understand them in an open and dialogic way. And also the formation of a digital therapy kite mark, which is really to protect both the interests of consumers and workers. I'm not saying these are solutions, but they're part of the mechanism of regulation of these big businesses, and they've been done in every other sector that's faced this level of transformation. I also think it's important in terms of finding a common language so that we're not talking into our professional silos, because that isn't where the solution or the energy will be found. There's a final provocation in the book, which is maybe it's a bit of a low blow. The last heading in the book is "Stop Dancing for Daddy," which is mean. And I say it to myself because when you're working in these systems, you can't fully take the moral high ground. But it's a good kind of like bringing me back to reality. It was gifted to me by Claire Slaney, who you may know has edited an important book, Counselling in Class, by PCCS Books. It leaves us with a question today and at the end of the book, which is, given that if Uber therapy isn't going to go away, how are we going to relate to each other in a way that we need to, that's informed and not trapping us within old debates that we need to move beyond? I would argue, and the book argues, that let's start by talking about money. Let's start by asking a really simple question. Are we really okay with £40 an hour and falling? And then ask ourselves the question, which you still hear people say, which is Uber therapy really nothing to do with me?